Good morning. So this is the Perennial podcast, which is the name we've decided to go with, and I think it's a good name. I like the alliteration. I have Ken here, and if there are any problems with the stream, just comment and let us know. I've also set up a Discord server if anyone wants to call in and remain anonymous. So we have a few things we'd like to talk about. The main theme being a parasitic versus a productive elite. And I'll go ahead and let Ken describe his thoughts on this dichotomy.
Yeah, so the a parasitic elite, if you want to look at the current situation, it's kind of like one of the villains from a Superman movie who hacks the global computer network and steals 1 cent out of everyone's bank account. And so he hasn't produced anything. He hasn't created anything. He's just skimmed a little bit off the top. And no one is really bothered enough to do anything about it because it's 1 cent after all. But now he's concentrated the highest amount of wealth in his hands. He can then control the media, control the churches, control the government. And then his vision of the world, the parasitic view of the world, gets enforced on everyone else. Whereas the alternative historically has been we have been ruled by a hereditary military dictatorship for most of European history. So these were people who had risen to power originally showing some kind of strategic insight into warfare or just physical prowess, and they rose to the top in this way, and then through primogeniture, they elevated their sons to the throne and to rule over their little fiefdom or kingdom. And so in this system, you can criticize it. You can say that it's based on violence. You can say that, well, the ability to win a war doesn't really tell you anything about the virtues of the person, and we could get into that. But from my perspective, it is better to have an elite which in that way is open. It's brutally honest about itself. There's no pretenses. There's no idea of, the elite, they arose through meritocracy. It's like, no, we know the mechanism through which they arose. It's transparent versus the parasitic model where everything is kind of in the background. Everything's in the shadows. No one understands finance well enough to understand how are these people attaining power? What kind of psychology do you need to attain power in a parasitical financial system? And then what kind of values are those people going to project onto the masses? Because ultimately what I'm trying to get to people is that the morality of the masses are very strictly, and this is in every situation, they're very strictly controlled by an elite, and they change very quickly. So we can get more into why that's important later.
Okay. What's coming to mind for me is the mythology of ancient Sumer and the Anunnaki, and some of Zechariah Sitchin's interpretations of these texts, which, granted, his translations are not on par with modern linguists, their interpretation of cuneiform. But the basic story, which I think is discernible in that ancient lore, and it spreads to other early civilizations as well, is the, I think, model of the parasitic elite. So there's some kind of god race that effectively harvests the labor of the slave classes and the rest of the political structure of Sumer. Now contrast that to the strategy of the Yamna, which develops into the broader Indo-European strategies. So I'm just going to side note for a second. The Yamna probably weren't ethnically discernible as what we would call modern Europeans. There's something like a proto-Europoid or something like that. But their strategy had to do with this kind of timocratic order, and that order established networks of contract. That's why in Indo-European mythology and morality, reciprocity, I give so that you may give, and like covenants relating to guests and all of that is so important. There are networks, reciprocal networks, and proprietarian contracts that are distributed. And there is an elite that controls it, but it's really not the same kind of like top-down corporate structure that you see in the idea of the Anunnaki, God caste, Middle Eastern ruling elite that did use monetary means from a very early date. I think basically what I'm interpreting this dichotomy to mean is the ancient Near Eastern strategy versus the Indo-European strategy, and they're two very different models of civilization.
Sure. Yeah. I I think that basically what we've had today with technology is an acceleration and an amplification of the money centered or financial centered strategy. If you do have a global banking system, then it's much easier to parasite off of that. If you have this huge digital system, it's harder, as in the time of revolutionary France, the tax collector had to go door to door, knocking on the door, asking for money. I mean, that's a much more brutal way of going about it. If you can just, there's a taxation system where the money comes out of your paycheck, you don't even notice it, and then during tax season, a lot of people get a refund, and they associate paying their taxes with getting money. But it's all smoke and mirrors. It's all the use of psychology to disguise what's really going on. And yeah, technology has really benefited that system. Whereas if you look at a system based on the idea of your worth on the battlefield, or who were your ancestors or something like that, that's the direction that the military has gone in with mechanized warfare. Even the invention of a machine gun took out so much of the individual, the idea of the king riding out on the front lines of the battlefield in front of the troops. That was something that was once seen as necessary for a leadership caste, that they needed to do that. And now, I mean, that's not even thinkable, the idea that the leader of the country would go out onto the battlefield with the troops. So the nature of warfare has changed, the nature of finance has changed, and it's really undermined a military aristocracy in its potentiality, and it's really amplified the ability for a financial aristocracy to consolidate power.
Yeah, that tracks very well, I think, with the Aryan versus Near Eastern model. What the timocratic, aristocratic, martial elite provides is protection of property. It's the insurer of last resort.
Mm-hmm.
It allows for contracts to be stable. So there is a productive service that's very tangible, and it's backed by something ultimately concrete. Whereas the Near Eastern model is based on narratives. It is linguistic, and monetary systems are linguistic. It's a narrative frame that they use to harvest the labor of everyone else. Now, what they can kind of like contract out the martial services, the timocratic services, because those have to be performed. But
Mm-hmm.
what we rely on for our government is the securement of our property and enforcement of contracts. That's provided by
Mm-hmm.
us. That's provided by the police. That's provided in part by our lawmakers. But we have
Mm-hmm.
this other level that ultimately has become far more influential than that kind of straightforward uh, Lockean or even Hobbesian conception of government.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Right. Yeah. So go on.
No, I'm kind of wondering, how does that factor in then with the emerging technocratic elite? Um, who is it? Carol Quigley outlines the phases of the ruling caste in Western civilization. And, there was a period where it was this martial aristocratic elite, and then mercantilists, um, capitalists, venture capitalists, um, and I think I skipped a step of like the managerial caste. But then we're now in the phase of rule by technocracy, these kind of, which is an extension of the clerk caste of the managerial class, and they are based out of Silicon Valley. They
Hmm.
construct narratives, but they're also, I think this is something like a synthesis between the Indo-European model and the Near Eastern model, to carry forward that metaphor, because they are providing spaces. They are defining territories and then setting forth the kind of logic of the communication of these spaces. And that's exactly what the Yamna do on the Pontic
Hmm.
Caspian steppe. They establish the grazing
Hmm.
rights, they establish the basic laws of reciprocity and contracts. Now, uh, they the technocratic elite also is in the business of propaganda. So, what do you think about that? The technocratic elite, is it a synthesis of what you call the productive and parasitic elite, or is it something completely different?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's an interesting idea, thinking of, and whenever I think of the internet as a physical space, to use that metaphor, I'm always drawn to the concept of libertarianism. Within a internet context, libertarianism makes perfect sense because we essentially have infinite physical space, infinite divisibility. You have your own little grazing rights over there. We'll be in the forum over here, and if you live in that world of the internet, it's easier to conceive of a workable libertarianism. And then you kind of go back to the physical real world and see the problems with that. But yeah, there is something that the internet provides, a lot of idea spaces that previously either weren't there, or I mean, if you look at how easy it is to stumble upon, I mean, this podcast that we're doing right now, random people can encounter it. Whereas if you think about the old material of this nature, when people were putting out things like this, it was that you had a mailing list. You had to opt into it. People would literally mail you a flyer or a CD or a cassette or something. That was so radically different, that opt in system. YouTube is promoting me. And it's not as if the CEO or whatever of YouTube wants to specifically promote me. They've just set up this algorithm that just says, look, we're going to show random videos to people. If they like them, we're going to promote them according to a certain algorithm. And so you can envision this kind of technocracy allowing for a kind of meritocracy where people are not proving themselves with swords or gunfights or something, but they're proving themselves with their natural charisma, which does relate back to, I mean, what is charisma? Charisma is the recognition of certain phenotypes and certain personality traits that ultimately originate in martial conflict. So, the kind of people who arise to power in a purely financial system, you look at their phenotypes and they've got the weak jaw, they're unattractive, they're not going to win any popularity contests. Whereas if you look at the kind of people who really succeed on YouTube, look at PewDiePie. He's one of the most successful YouTubers, and he has like 100% Bavarian phenotype. So, that kind of thing. And the reason why he has that, and the reason why people recognize that, the implicit story behind his face and his personality is a martial story. It is a story of, coming in with warfare, establishing property law, and then maintaining that property law from criminals who would try to subvert it. So I mean, there is something in the technocracy that allows openings for people to bring back something of the Marshall story and the Marshall perspective into the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. They are capitalizing on the instincts that especially European people have to look towards that
Mm-hmm.
sort of elite, in contrast with Middle Eastern types. But what I
Mm-hmm.
see really happening is they are farming that potential. They're farming the narrative
Mm-hmm.
construction that they previously engaged in directly. In the past, they controlled religion, they controlled mythology, they set down the rituals. Now, they are farming out the cognitive elite of their subject population to produce these narratives in a wide variety of forms so that um, they're pretty much covering all of their bases. Now, like, just look at YouTube. They are farming off the top 30% of super chats, whatever percent of the ads on the videos. And this is an effective strategy. Maybe not financially for YouTube, because apparently they're still losing money on that. Google is. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's analogous to the narrative caste, the Anunnaki, the God caste, farming the police activity, the aristocratic activity of the kind of natural. Well, like look at the Natufians or the whatever indigenous peoples of the Middle East. They all tribes are organized by that strongest man kind of idea where somebody is able to secure the tribe, somebody is able to lead it in warfare, and that caste is
Mm-hmm.
farmed by the people who created the narratives, the the early mass hypnosis type indoctrination, mind control. That's basically how I see it. To put it in conspiratorial terms. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and now instead of farming that caste, they're the like I kind of we discussed this in a previous episode. The pyramid has moved up, and now they're farming people to do the job that they used to do. And it makes me wonder
Mm-hmm.
now they're kind of these systems engineers and architects of the electronic spaces. And I think it's easy to like idealize the internet and imagine that libertarian norms could hold, but the fact that censorship is so yes, dabbing is a sin, so we don't dab here. There's a chat in the so
No,
uh,
I got you. I'm 100%. Dabbing is haram.
I'm sorry, Eric. What was that, Ken? What was I just saying?
You were just talking about
Pyramids
some
moving up, systems
pyramids
architecture.
moving up.
Oh yeah, idealizing
Yeah,
the internet. So this
yeah.
censorship is possible because the internet is a series of tubes. It's a distributed network of fiber optics and copper and hubs and satellite systems, and that's just how the whole thing is structured. It's owned by private entities and monopolized by a handful of private entities. So I think basically the people, like I've heard JF articulate this, that we can kind of move past physical community and the organic national structure and have community at the level of this connection via internet technologies. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's it's the same thing that Rome would do uh, or the early Aryan systems would do with franchising the means of social control. So you absorb from the cognitive elite who want to take advantage of the internet. The beneficiaries of internet technology seemingly are the people with successful websites and blogs and YouTube channels and the people who can monetize. But they're equivalent to the clerk class, the managerial caste, who is hired by the true aristocracy in the medieval period. So that's why I'm kind of skeptical of an internet-based path, because the technocrats are the
Mm-hmm.
systems engineers who are harvesting our creative output, including this, which is kind
Mm-hmm.
of
Right.
there's no other alternative though, it seems.
Right. Yeah. I mean, what are you going to do? You're going to get out on your soapbox in the middle of the street and start screaming at people, or again, go back to mailing out flyers, mailing out cassettes, mailing out CDs. And people did that. I mean, because that was just what you did. There was no other alternative. It seems ridiculous now to do that. But it's also little bit ridiculous what we're doing. And some people call it clown world. The whole thing is strange, but you have to deal with what you have. I mean, obviously the internet has faults, and obviously the internet, I mean, at the domain registrar level, these people are ideological, and it's not an ideological spectrum, it's an ideological consensus at the very top. They have the ability to shut down everyone and anybody very, very quickly. That's why Google wants to own YouTube, even if it's losing money, because that gives it social power. They can just activate and shut it down if they want. And you saw this, they shut down altright.com. Now, there wasn't really an effort to bring it back up. So, there's kind of fault on both sides with that. But, you saw that, and then you saw a bunch of DDoSing attacks against other websites. And there was a time there where basically you had like the top 5 alt-right websites or something all down, all just not working, not accessible. And so you're talking about hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of people who view those websites unable to access them with really no substantial alternatives. And that was just, a short period of time. And that could be done for a longer period of time. And I think part of the whole Charlottesville thing, you can talk about whether it was intentional or accidental or how that works there. But I mean, it basically was prepping people. Ultimately, the effect was everyone said, oh, we're not going to get out in the streets again. So, I mean, doesn't that make it easy to, if you just shut down everyone's internet networks, they have no recourse as, hey, you shut down our websites, we're going out in the streets now, because that's been kind of blocked off psychologically as an option.
Should we go to shortwave radio?
What's that?
Shortwave radio? Should that be
the shortwave radio. There you go. These are the options, and none of them are really good because it's not a good situation, and this. People need to realize this, because people need to realize that, we don't live in a libertarian society. The freedom of speech, freedom of expression, what's really important is power of expression and the influence of your expression. If I am free to scream alone in, the woods somewhere where no one's around, then, okay, you can call that freedom of expression. But really what we mean when we say freedom of expression is the ability to influence other people with our expression. If we don't have the ability or the power to influence others, then again, we might as well be screaming in the woods. It's a non sequitur. So the First Amendment, the freedom of expression, has really been thrown out the window. It doesn't exist. People need to realize that. And any expression that does reach your ears that is contrary to a mainstream narrative is simply because either they haven't perfected their systems, or they want people to let off a little bit of steam. And they say it's better to have a system in which we have a kind of controlled opposition rather than totally shutting everything down. And that's when the pressure builds up that people get resentful and then people get violent and so on. So it's better to have things this way from their perspective. And then, what is a person to do?
It's a very old strategy.
Pessimistic about it.
Boiling frog.
Yeah, it's a very old strategy. Yep. Right, boiling frog. This is, when you're faced in this situation, you can become pessimistic about it. But as I just made a video, I mean, the Indo-Europeans, it took them thousands of years to really wipe out the native languages there. So when we talk about one system replacing another, one system declining, we're talking about a very long time. And I just listened to the Golden One. He had a speech at Ameren, and he says, we want to present ourselves well. We want quality over quantity. but we also are running out of time. We only have, 20, 30 years till we're a minority and then it's game over. And this has been, white nationalists have been saying this for a very long time. I mean, white nationalists were saying this, or nationalists were saying it in the 20s and the 30s. I mean, this kind of thing of we only have so many decades left. The way I think about it is we are a minority. We are the Greeks under Ottoman domination. That has already happened. It's not that we're running out of time, it's that our civilization has collapsed as we once knew it. You can say, oh, we're still technically a majority. Theoretically, we could vote ourselves out of this. But again, it's not to be pessimistic, it's not to be defeatist. It's just to recognize the majority minority dynamic, that we are not in control of this civilization. And that's okay, because we have seen examples of people before who are not in control, who were a minority, who were oppressed, who were conquered, and yet they persisted in their identity. They built up an elite, they built up traditions, they did survive, and then eventually they did reverse the trend and they did, take over the people who were previously oppressing them. So again, it's not to be, I mean, I guess people don't like that idea. It's more exciting to think that we're going to have a nationalist revolution in the next few decades. But the realistic picture is that, we are a minority and we need to start acting like a minority. And we need to start thinking in terms of multi-generational struggles and not like, if we just get Donald Trump elected his next term, then something amazing will happen. And there are still people who are on board with that. I get the mass appeal and I get the emotional appeal of that. But it does make people depressed because getting Donald Trump elected again is not going to solve the core problems. And then you're going to be back where you started, and people disengage with that. Right. It's not a sustainable strategy, ultimately.
The sense of imminent catastrophe, I understand, because you look at the demographic trends, we're going to be a minority in the next 50 years,
well,
most likely.
Are a minority. No, we are a minority now.
Well,
that's I hate when people say that we're going to be a minority. Like, it's a good normie talking point. But at this point, I'm tired of hearing it because it implies that we should be pursuing a majoritarian strategy when if you look at kids now, white kids are a minority. They are the minority.
Sure. But as far as looking, when you're walking down the street and you're seeing faces, in most places, you're still seeing majority European peoples. But what I was trying to say was that even after we become a minority, it's not over. Mm-hmm. Democratic options will disappear, and past a certain point, even secessionist ideas will disappear. But the struggle is not going to be over until we're all gone. Even with just 5,000 of us, it's possible to come back from that. Populations do go through bottlenecks, and they do come back. So, now going back to what the technocratic elite provides, what is their production? It's these systems of communication, right? And they're structured to suit their genetic interests ultimately. Now, if you look at going back to the Aryan conception, that's kind of the archetype, the ideal of what government provides. And you can read it at a surface level as contracts and reciprocity, but what that effectively is a eugenic system, because it has to do with the construction of the monopolization of territory and utilization of resources. And what are resources for? Ultimately, providing for the next generation. And if you control who receives resources, you control effectively who breeds. So what the elite in Aryan society constructed was a eugenic system. That was their product. And what the technocracy has produced is a dysgenic system for the masses and a eugenic system for themselves. And that's incredibly intelligent. But, imagine, 100 years, 200 years down the line, we are a narrow minority. Maybe we exist in pockets in some cities in Argentina, and then, I don't know, somewhere in Canada, or Alaska. We have these few settlements. As long as we can provide that original function of the productive aristocracy, the eugenic function, we're going to be fine. Now, I'm not actually worried about the fate of the wider Western population because they're sinners and they're degenerate and they've kind of brought on what's happening to themselves. I do view us as responsible
Oh
fundamentally.
no.
Now maybe you disagree with that, but I don't have
Yeah.
a huge amount of concern. Yes, they've been brainwashed. Yes, all
Hmm.
these things, but ultimately, the information has been out there. People can escape this. And I see it. I've heard a metaphor during a sermon at one point when I was attending a Baptist church that was like hell or going to hell is like you're in this nice, comfy room. Maybe you have a TV that you're watching, some video games, popcorn, Monster energy drinks, and you're just the door's open though. You know, if I stay here too long, I'm going to be trapped. I'm not going to be able to get up. And people just sit there as the door slowly closes. And we've been
Mm,
just sitting here enjoying the degeneracy and effectively consigning ourselves to hell. So
okay.
that's what
Yeah.
that's what we've
I
chosen to
see
do.
the, yeah. Yeah.
But it is still voluntary. The door is still open, and anyone who wants to get up and walk through it, um, everything that we need to do, we have the information necessary to do it, and that's effectively only constructing what the technocrats construct: networks of information exchange, controlling those networks, and getting into the business of the original function of law, the ultimate telos of law, which is like um, funneling or channeling our reproductive energies into an ideal, constructing that ideal. What do you make of that?
Yeah. I mean, people, what is the morale, to what extent are people responsible for themselves? And I think of the average person as a child, and I don't really project responsibility onto them. I think it probably is useful to talk about what you're talking to individuals to say, like, look, this is the way you're living your life. You have a choice. You can get out of this or you can stay in this. I think that's useful. Um, but I just differentiate between people and say, I think that people as they are, if they had rulers who wanted to make them into decent people, they could do that very quickly. I think a lot of this, I mean, the hedonic impulse is very old. And it's only recently that you have an elite that's like, hey, you have a hedonic impulse. That's what your life should be centered around. Whereas usually it was like, yeah, you have one, you should suppress that.
Right.
And people just act accordingly. So, free will, I guess that's like an important psychological or philosophical concept, but I look at it more as people have different degrees of free will. Most people don't really have a great degree of free will. Some individuals do, and those individuals are responsible. So, definitely, if you're listening to this, you're responsible, and shame on you for not, joining our podcast or whatever. But, the majority of people, when I look at the average person on the street, people who are engaging in things that are going to harm their future, harm the future of their children, or they're anti-natalist or something. I really just feel pity for them, and I don't think they deserve all of the bad thing. In the same way that if a child runs across the street without looking both ways, I don't say, oh well, it's their fault because they got hit. Like they could have listened or something. It's like no, they're not capable of that, and they need to have their hand held, and they need
Right.
someone to control them. So
As individuals, I
I
see
do
what you're
believe in that.
saying, and it's good to have
Yeah.
mercy on individual Westerners. But when I
Hmm.
talk about like the failure of us as a people collectively, it's collectively our
Hmm.
responsibility because we're not ultimately individuals. We can't parse out um, our moral culpability versus the moral networks that we're inbuilt into. and the evolution of the civilization is a collective responsibility. Yeah, if you're going to talk about individual agency, the majority of that is concentrated in the elite, but I think we all do play a role in shaping that. And
Mhm.
so when I blame like Western civilization is dead because we have allowed the norms to degrade. And that, yeah, you shift most of the blame on the elite, like the people
Yeah.
who are especially responsible, probably the Anglo elite. They're primarily responsible for this. That is the Anglo question.
Mhm.
They sold us out. Um, but yeah, I think the point of this is then to distance yourself from this group that is morally culpable for a sordid past. That's the SJW
Mhm.
narrative of whites generally. And in a sense, it's correct. It's not correct for the reason that they think that, oh, we enslaved people, we
Mhm.
did these bad things. Like, no,
Mhm.
it's we're responsible for not upholding those traditional hierarchical structures
Yeah.
and not upholding that traditional deontological ethic. So that
Yeah.
civilization is kind of spiraling, and we can walk out of it at any point. And
Mhm.
so, but let's go ahead and just switch to the next topic. So I know you sent me a list of some things that you had in mind, and let me look at
Yeah. I
some
probably.
things in the while you look
Yeah.
at
You
that
can
and pick
take
what
a
you
look.
want to say. I'm just going to read the comments that are here. Um,
Okay.
so Rattle Grebdron wants to try out testing some donation on Streamlab. I don't know if I'm going to enable that at the moment. I probably will eventually because if someone wants to, I appreciate that. I'll go ahead and accept it. And it is kind of the Indo-European thing to do. I, you know, I give so that you may give. If you receive something of value, you exchange something. So I guess, why not? And then,
That would be very Indo-European of you
yeah.
if you did that.
Um, and Rattle again. Yeah, the Anglo question. They there's got to be some kind of solution to it. I guess they've already. Uh, I do wonder though sometimes, like the royal family, the upper crust, aristocratic British society. They're not dumb. I mean, these people are so well educated, so they have all the information in the world available to them. What's their
Mhm.
game? What are they planning? Or have they just merged into the global elite? I guess at a certain point in time, they effectively were the global elite, and that's very recent in history. So, if you're going to look to a source of globalists, the people who are there now, Jews, Anglos, and a very few others. But so yeah, what's the next topic, Ken?
Oh, I was just too intensely listening to that. I don't know, race and gender as ideals. I was kind of throwing out this, the transgender phenomenon. It's really easy to basically be disgusted by these people because you see a man in a dress and your instant impulse is like fight or flight. Basically, it's like it's very harsh, but I think it's an interesting topic because there's this strong narrative being put out there that gender is a spectrum, that there's more difference between within races than between races, and so on. So there's always this spectral thinking. This, well, these dichotomies don't exist. It's not a binary thing. It's not, you're not black or white, but you can be somewhere in between. You're not male or female, but you're somewhere in between. And there's an impulse to hear that and to say, no, it's Adam and Steve, or no, wait, that's wrong. It's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. Just brute force. Be like, no, you're male or you're female. You're black or you're white. It's this or it's that, and to be straight about it. But I think there's a kind of an interesting opening here when this narrative is being pushed so strongly to say, you know what? Yeah, race is a spectrum, gender is a spectrum. And really, what we're talking about here is just like on the color spectrum, you have pure red, pure blue, and purple in between. You have an ideal of a white person, an ideal of a black person, which may not exist in reality, but different people are moving toward or away those ideals and forming new ideals and infinite possibilities. And gender is the same way, that you can have male and you can have female, and people are moving away or toward, or they're going in different directions, and society as a whole is changing its orientation. And is that good or is it bad? So, okay, yeah, it's all a spectrum. Gender's a spectrum, race is a spectrum. But what side of that spectrum are we moving toward? And is it useful to have ideals? I mean, obviously, as someone who's transgendered has an ideal of femininity. He's a man and he wants to aspire toward the ideal of femininity. And in some sense, as perverse as it might be, this transgender person is seeking for a higher idealism in their life. They don't have any purpose. And then the feminine ideal comes to them and they say, if only I can achieve this feminine ideal, then finally my empty, purposeless life will gain meaning. And so there's something there, that striving for something is ultimately rooted in idealism. And so once we realize the necessity of idealism, then we can kind of clear our heads, step back and say, whoa, idealism is necessary, but maybe, chopping off your genitals is not the way to go about it. There's different ideals. That's not the only one. Like, we have other options here that might be better. So I think that's kind of an interesting synthesis maybe of the hard left and hard right positions on things like gender and race.
Yeah, absolutely. The divine or primordial androgyne has been a motif in the circles that have transformed into the globalist elite. You can see that in alchemical literature. You can see it even in Plato, one of the myths from the symposium about the origin of love and how we were all kind of both genders combined into one. It's interesting that this primordial androgyne is usually conceived of as male, though. Somehow a masculine androgyne, but the way of going about it, the way of returning to that primordial state, kind of a quest for Eden, is being done through transhumanism, which is through human agency, i.e. human will, retracing the steps of the bifurcation through a material process. So this is a fundamental inversion of the perennialist, idealist ethic of a return to the one. So it's a materialist corruption of that. And everything that has to do with breaking down gender roles, I see basically as an experiment, a social experiment on the part of this alchemical elite questing after the masculine androgyne. And you notice that what they are asserting in all of this non-binary stuff is extremely masculine. You look at these people, even the ones who are trannies, and they're very confrontational and they're very opinionated. And, it's not a feminine ideal at all. I think what's happening with feminism is the death of femininity and the spreading of the masculine androgyne ideal across the spectrum. And all they can do, and it's the same with race, to attain that materialistic unity, because they seek power, they seek to control everything on the planet. They already inventory all our natural resources. They know how much gold is out there. They know all these things. They're very interested in that, where the oil is. So they inventory everything, including our sexual predilections and our behaviors. And if they can break down gender norms, if they can break down racial solidarity, then all we have left is to be imprinted. We're like a blank slate, to use the Lockean phrase, to be imprinted in the way that they want.
That's very interesting, because everyone looks at Locke and they see Locke as, oh, he's describing human psychology. He's describing us as a blank slate. But really, the way he's ultimately been used is prescriptive, that we should be blank slates. Not that we are, but that if we are, we're sinful. Like, it's a mark of sin to have an inborn identity of masculine, feminine, black, white. that's sinful, and you need to be wiped clean and be this blank slate so that we can imprint anything we want on you, so you can become this perfect individual, because all this pre-rational, precognitive, instinctual stuff is baggage. It's not logical, it's not secular, it's animalistic, it's primitive. And if you have any of this, you're an animal,
You're
basically. You're
unenlightened.
less, yeah, you're
Unenlightened.
unclean, and you need to be wiped clean so that you can have this perfect, and obviously I'm thinking here about like the laws of Shabbat, where you can flip a light switch the night before so that the next day, through a Rube Goldberg machine, it comes on, and so on. The 613 laws or whatever that are of what you can and cannot do. The whole idea behind that is, the laws themselves are silly and irrelevant, but the idea is to break down a person psychologically so that they come to value things like flipping on and off a light switch more than they value human life. And that is a conditioning mechanism. And that's kind of what they want for people, so that the issue you're willing to fight and die for is which bathroom is a person using, rather than are you going to defend your culture, your ethnic history, your identity, your children. Are you even going to have children, right? So traditionally, people would, first thing you'd fight for is the existence of your children. Then now people are fighting for the existence of gender neutral bathrooms, and so on and so forth. So it is. I totally agree with what you're saying in that sense, and it's something that has happened before, right? This is an old concept, and even while it has existed, you've had cultural creation, you've had maintenance of tradition, you've had the evolution of tradition. So obviously, like, technology and a lot of factors amplify this, but you've had plenty. I mean, you've had plenty of attempts to wipe away people's identity, and they've succeeded in maintaining that identity under fairly improbable odds. So yeah, the whole spectrum thing, I just think, is a useful talking point, and it flips people around. They're used to saying no, gender's a spectrum, and then the opposition of no, it's just male and female. And if you can say, instead of providing the resistance of just standing there like a rock and saying no, you stop talking, I don't want to hear your perspective. If you just say no, you're totally right, and that's why we need a masculine ideal. That's why we need a feminine ideal. That's why we need the ideal of whiteness in the abstract, in opposition to these other racial ideals. So.
Right. I think it, from the elite perspective, the ideal is the androgyne. The ideal is like breaking down the types into a pure spectrum. That's the ideal of
Mhm.
equality. And what they're doing is deconstructing what you're advocating to erect again, which is kind of forcefully asserting these ideal structures in spite of the nature of the spectrum. So we're creating the masculine as well as idealizing it, and I think the same applies to race as well. People can say that there's more difference between than with or within than between and all this stuff about race, saying, oh, it's
Mhm.
a spectrum, how are you going to divide the lines? And you can just say, well, I have an ideal of what I want humanity to be, and that's inherently
Mhm.
racialistic. You can't have an ideal for humanity that doesn't include some notion of race, unless what you're trying
Mhm.
to conceive for humanity is a collection of different things. But you can't have any comprehensive account of the difference there. It's just you're not creating a coherent ideal if what you're saying is you don't want discrimination in humanity. What you're saying then is that you refuse to construct an ideal and want rather
Right.
to be a blank slate ready for imprintment or whatever. So there's a few
Right.
more
Right.
chats that I want to read, and
Oh, you go ahead.
Tuoth. So is the future to be a tribe within a tribe, or can we open new frontiers to allow a better society to develop, like space? Or are there other options? My favorite option is becoming the mole people. I think we should have underground cities, definitely. Um,
Oh, come on. Don't tell me you're so blue pilled. You don't know these cities already exist in the center of the earth. Come on. Come
um,
on.
you could always immigrate to the Nazi moon colony. I hear they're doing well.
Yeah, you have a huge selection of real estate. You got the Nazi moon colony, the Nazi Antarctic base, the Nazi Hollow Earth colony. So there's plenty of choices. Just, get on esotericrealestate.com and start searching for something in your price range.
Um, but in actuality, the tribe within a tribe, there's no tribe to be within. I mean, yes, form the tribe,
Mm.
form the ideal, construct that. It's your responsibility, it's your act of will, which for most people, that's going to take the form of following someone with a compelling ideal. Um, no, Joseph Campbell. I like his comparative mythological work. The last volume of his four-volume The Masks of God is creative mythology, and he has a pretty comprehensive explanation of why this is the kind of evolution of mythology, and it's the form that it's taken. We're now in a very self-consciously agential mode, and we are effectively, with our conception of government, looking at competing rather than political scientists. We're looking at competing political artists, and the construction, the creation of ideals is what's relevant for most people. You just pick the artists that you like and follow them. But the
Mm-hmm.
market is available. If you look at what the neo-reactionaries have been talking about for years, it's about providing a service that people want to subscribe to, and creation of cities. Now, what kind of concerns me is that what I've seen the last time I went and looked on the neo-reactionary, one of the websites that they have, they were talking effectively about the construction of smart cities, and that's exactly also what the elites have been talking about for some time. So I don't know. It's a challenge because anything that we come up with in a positive sense is going to be used by them and corrupted by them. Um, so, I mean, it's definitely a challenge to create this tribe within uh, a culture of um, anime, not anime, but anomic culture, this kind of chaotic culture. The formation of anything, it
No,
really,
we need to create a culture of anime to destroy this anomic culture.
there you go.
That's really what we need.
And now, Rattle again. What do you think about neo reaction? I didn't read the comment. That's funny. I almost get the impression that some of them want to hide until Russia liberates Europe or something. They do promote local communities. Yeah, I agree with that. I think that people do want community, and I've talked about this before. Like there are dating sites out there to find a mate. To a very limited extent, there are some options for other less, you know, other more platonic forms of solidarity structures like meetup.com or something like that. But community is really what people, I think, do want. And if it has to include some smart technology, fine. But like constructing housing complexes, I mean, this exists in actual fact. People do this. They buy a bunch of real estate and build a housing development that's integrated. They have a common community center. People go for this, and these properties are very lucrative for the people managing them. There are markets for the construction of community, and if you take a lesson from the technocrats, if you construct the dialectic in a proper sense, if you construct the relation of nodes and do your system's architecture, then you can have an extraordinary impact on the end state of the minds of the people in that space. Now, to do that and also incorporate a racial ideal is extremely difficult in the present legal context, simply because you're not allowed to discriminate on a racial basis, which means you can't really have an intergenerational conception of what the community is to be. The only space that's
Mm-hmm.
going to be allowed is a religious space. And, I've thought before, like, yes, I like Catholicism. I like going to church, and I like that it has been around for 2,000 years. I think that is the model to move out of, but some kind of explicit formulation of a new religious structure I've intuited as a necessity for years. If for no other reason than the legal limitations on the construction of any kind of higher ideal for humanity. In a religious context, you can
Hmm.
have marital laws. So just to put out an example of this process, you could accept absolutely everyone into your religious community as long as you have one eugenic law that says that a woman must marry a man lighter than herself. Carry that over to the nth generation, everybody's white.
Hmm.
All you need is
Well,
a limited number of
they're either
eugenic
white
laws.
or like kabuki theater Asians, but yeah, I mean, you could theoretically do something like that. But as far as constructed religions go, there was the Church of the Creator, there was cosmotheism and creativity, and these various projects of like, we need a new religion. And I don't know that it really works like that. I mean, if you look at any ethno religious group who previously had an ethno state, then they were conquered, it's not like, oh shit, we were conquered. Let's form a new ethno religion. Quick, guys. I mean, you could almost say that Christianity, in some ways, was a bunch of Jews freaking out, having like a racial crisis and being like, we need some kind of new religion here. What's going on? But most of the time, the people who survive and maintain their identity are not the ones who are like, let's do something radically different. It's the ones who are like, let's stay with the traditions, let's evolve them to a new context. So I think basically, there is a European canon.
Yeah,
It is
absolutely. I'm not
Christian.
saying
It
something
is, yeah, right,
radically unchristian. I'm saying we
right,
have
right,
to
right, right.
move the paradigm to the next step.
Yeah, I'm saying people have heard your comments of like, we need to look in a religious direction, and they're like, okay, so how are we going to now pray to Odin? Like, how are we going to do all this stuff? How are we going to create this entirely new thing? Because the church is corrupt, and obviously we can't grow something good out of something that's dying, so we just have to reject that, create something new. And I'm saying, historically, that's not how it's worked. Historically, if you want to survive, you have to take what you've got and you have to run with it and keep going with it, and to just say like, oh, we've had a crisis, let's abandon all our traditions and do something radically new, something radically different, or just like cut and paste, cut out like Christianity from the European canon, try to purify it, like, and it's almost in the way that you get these Christians who try to like take out Christmas. They say Halloween is a pagan holiday. They try to remove paganism from Christianity and be like Jews for Jesus. And that's the kind of same mentality of these people who are like, we have to remove all vestiges of Christianity from European peoples and go pure paganism. It's like, well, okay, astrology is pagan, but astrology is from Babylon. So, I mean, are you going to tell me that, oh, we have to get out? I mean, if you look at these European pagans, how many of them are into astrology? So, yeah, the purism thing, you could call it purity spiraling, but like, people have to realize that when you talk about religion, it is a tradition, and it's not, you don't get to pick and choose necessarily. You kind of have to accept what you're given and grow something out of that and nurture something out of that. But it's not like a hard and fast, and that's how most quote unquote new religions start. Like Mormonism had a Christian canon, added one book, and kind of evolved in that direction. And they've actually kind of returned to the Christian norm in a lot of way. They were trying polygamy, they were trying all these new things, and they kind of hyperextended, and now they're kind of returning to the norm in a lot of ways. So yeah, it's a complicated subject, and I don't want
Well, no,
I don't
I
want
see what
anyone to go
you're,
start sacrificing goats in the desert is basically my message. And people
and
have done that.
I see
So
that concern. obviously,
Mhm.
it's, in Protestantism, you have a tradition of starting new sects, and there's no great,
Mhm.
you know, taboo associated with that. Starting a religious community doesn't have to be radically different from Christianity. And even when it comes to
Mhm.
like establishing that eugenic framework, because if you look at it evolutionarily,
Mhm.
that's the function that must be performed. That was the original service provided by the elite. How to provide that? Well, if it's not provided naturally from like the texts of the New Testament, and we are a
Mhm.
Christian civilization, we have to maintain that aspect of it without, I mean, if you break it, then I think the shock to the psyche is just, I think broader Western civilization proves that getting rid of that Christian underpinning is simply too much for us to handle. You can't have this hard break and a radical transformation.
Right.
But what you can,
Right.
what I think with Christianity, Gnostic Christianity, early Christianity, a lot of people, and I like looking at trends in a broad way. Protestants are often calling for this, and even there are some Catholic theologians that are asking for this as well. A return to a primitive Christianity. Christianity took on, and it's like what you said with eliminating the pagan aspects, but Christianity took on a high degree of formalism at a very early date that doesn't seem to be evident in the first decades of the church as far as we can tell. And so,
Mhm.
personally, the route that I would take is going back to, okay, what is Jesus's actual message except the gospel? And that has nothing to do necessarily with the epistles of Paul and all this other stuff. The gospel is a general story. It can be told in a couple of paragraphs, and it's basically a
Mhm.
telling of the Orphic narrative. It's a telling of the Hindu ideal of the avatar. It's saying that the divine does enter into the mundane, and if you rely on that, and if you sacrifice your ego and your will to that, it will guide you. It will save you. I mean, it's such a basic thing. It's all that you need. You need nothing else, and it's simple enough that everyone can comprehend it. So if that's the gospel, call him Christ, call him whatever you want. It's the message, and it's good enough.
Mhm.
Now, and then on top of that, the early Christian church was likely an initiatic order. So there were stages of becoming a Christian, and vestiges of that exist in the Orthodox Church. They exist in Catholicism. You are baptized and initiated at a cursory level, and then you learn various things, and you're confirmed. And then maybe, to be able to be a host of the, or what do they call it? The people who are allowed to hand out the Eucharist in the Catholic Church. I
Mhm.
forget. But there are phases of initiation: priesthood, becoming a cardinal, becoming a bishop, ultimately becoming the pope. Like it is an initiatic order, and there's phases of being drawn into higher orders of the mystery, and more of that becoming exposed to you. And I think that's firmly traditional. That's Christian. Now, what we can do with that is take all of the scholarship of comparative mythology and take all of the empirical data that's out there, the vast literature on traditionalism and comparative mythology and perennialism, and enrich that primordial Christian tradition. That's my route for we need a new religious formulation. It doesn't have to be, and none of it has to be new. All that we have to do is put together the components that logically should be put together. And I don't
Mhm.
think you have to sacrifice any um, ideal of being truthful in it, or even an ideal of being faithful to tradition. We're getting some more
Mhm.
comments, so I'll just read these real quick,
Cool.
and then Septius: religions require a charismatic leader. Typically, even Odin was likely a warrior king. I agree with that. I think that Odin was a warrior king. Probably came um, to Scandinavia from the Eastern Empire, somewhere north of Byzantium in like the maybe the second or third century A.D. And the Odinic mysteries are so similar to Christianity, probably because the historical Odin was at some level familiar with Christianity. Um, you know, so anyway, positive Christianity. Aaron probably has more of a positive Christianity ideal than I do, and I have more of a perennialist Christianity. It's slightly different. Um, positive Christianity doesn't really have like metaphysical commitments. I don't know how you would have an initiatic tradition within positive Christianity. RJ, there's no need to pick and choose. Orthodox Christianity has all that is needed, does it not? Orthodox Christianity has metaphysical commitments that I think are false. It also is not able to justify what happens in the early church to legitimate the structure. I think there's a lot of just piling on historical instances and then legitimating them ex post facto. Um, Now, that's just looking at the very earliest records we have. I don't think it's enough to formulate this whole system. But Orthodox Christianity, as a ritual, I mean, maintaining something to build off of, certainly. But I do believe that objective metaphysics is possible through a phenomenological path. I think philosophy has to continue developing in this area. And I think it's not separate from developments in science and physics. Orthodox theology was not able to evolve as much as Catholic theology was, and Catholic theology gave rise to an academic system which discovered modern science. So I think there's a stultifying aspect of Orthodox Christianity, just looking at the evidence. These are static communities by and large, and that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in pursuing the truth and digging deeper into the truth. When I say perennialism, it's not that the whole thing has been revealed and it's permanently done. It's like, in a sense, it is at a kind of very broad cosmological level of interpretation, but perennialism is more so a tradition that has been developing through historical time and needs to continue developing using new methods. And I don't see that path in Orthodoxy. Yeah, theology is not supposed to evolve. The true theology is not supposed to evolve because it's supposed to, we're seeking a truth out there. But methods of articulation do evolve, and a clearer exposition, even of well-known things. I think it's an anti-philosophical worldview. It closes the door to new philosophical inquiry and ultimately reduces to, axiomatic propositions. And you're relying on faith, on historical sources that you don't even know if they're legitimate, if they weren't put there by someone who had some sort of political or personal agenda. It's not epistemologically fundamental. It starts with a set of axioms given to you extrinsically by some source that you can't interrogate. I don't see that as a basis for a truthful worldview. So I'm really not into that at all. I think you have to be able to always question and look for the truth. It's, in a sense, it's a liberal ethos because it's open-minded, but I think that's just the aspect of liberalism that is truthful. I think there are aspects of that hard conservative traditionalist aspect that are truthful, and there are aspects of the progressive mentality that are truthful. Catholics don't read the Bible, though. Yeah, and that's why Catholicism is a lot freer and more ritualistic in a sense than Orthodoxy. Yeah, the Orthodox rituals are solemn and they have a certain air about them, but Catholics, I don't know. I like Catholics. I always liked every Catholic that I've met by and large. There's something about, they don't know the theology. They're not limited by it. They have their own opinions. Does this accord with the teaching of the church? I don't know. But I go to church and it's like, I like it. I do. Mark Citadel wrote an excellent article about the Germanic soul and how it sometimes is/was incompatible with the Southern/Mediterranean Catholic faith. Yeah, there's someone else. I read a very similar. Oh, it's because that's in the, what is it? Myth of the 20th Century by Rosenberg. It's that narrative is in there. Have you seen Pat Payon? Have you seen Richard Carrier's work? Jesus did not exist, so why would you build a religion on that? Yeah, frankly, I don't care if Jesus as a historical figure existed to exactly correspond with the Gospels. The ideal of the avatar is what's relevant, and as long as there's no hard evidence against the possibility of a figure like the historical Christ in that time frame, I don't care if it
Mhm.
corresponds point for point with the New Testament account. I mean, just the Gospels, the way they're structured, they're foretellings of a historical event, and we just have to have faith that there is something there corresponding to that historical event. Um, so I don't know. Nothing has to fall or stand on that point alone. And then, what are your thoughts on the irony bros? I don't know what that means. Anyway, sorry, one last comment, and then I'm going to go back to Ken. Right and philosophy necessarily leads to the requirement of the revelation of truth. Building or adding on to philosophy is like building an endless tower that will never touch the sky. Um, there's just RJ. There's no basis for the revelation beyond an axiomatic faith that ultimately is arbitrary, because you could equally have axiomatic faith in some other revelation. There's no reason fundamentally to accept this particular revelation. It's not a philosophical worldview. I do believe in that endless pursuit of truth. So, and I think that a system built on that is going to be better in the long run. Anyway, back to Ken.
Yeah, so irony bros, it's a term that's applied and misapplied to different people at different times. But I think one of the core features of being an irony bro is that you just don't take this stuff seriously. You say stuff like, "This is not a serious movement," and I think there is something advantageous to that, because when you have people who are so super serious all the time that they're like, "Yeah, we only have 5 years, or we only have 2 years, and then we got to do something now. We got to strike hard. We got to strike now. We got to do something, man. Got to take action. Got to get in the streets, man." And people are so serious, and it's a personality type. And what the irony bros do is they kind of put out a message, or they put out a certain kind of sarcasm or something, where you make fun of that attitude and you demean it, and you alienate these people and you make them very mad at you, and you get them frustrated so that they disengage, and they say, "Oh, I'm not going to deal with this anymore." So you could view it as a kind of demoralization, but I think ultimately it's good. I think that there's been this idea that everyone should just try whatever they think is best. And if you think what's best is going out in the streets, and marching and beating up, anti fascists, then you go ahead and do that, because we can't possibly predict what the effects of that are. No one really knows what the best strategy, or they'll take the diversity of argument of, "Oh, we just all specialize, and you go do your street battles, and we'll have our memes over here, and everyone does their own thing." I just think that's a fail. That's a big fail. I mean, it would be like saying, "Well, you just have your Islam over here, and we're just going to have our Christianity over here, and it's just going to all." Just a diversity of strategy. We're all going for the same thing, right? But no, there really are different ideals here. There are really different priorities, and I do think it is a kind of war of ideas. So I think alienating people, and on my videos, I love to alienate people. My best videos, the ones I like the best, are the ones that have the most downvotes, because I know I'm alienating people. I know I'm upsetting people, and that is really one of the best things that I can do, is get people angry and get people downvoting the video. I mean, an upvote, anyone can just be lazy and say, "Oh yeah, I like this. This is good. I upvote it." But a downvote means that I angered someone enough that they actually were like vindictive and vengeful, and they really wanted to hurt me and leave a nasty comment or whatever. That really is the goal for me. And I think the irony bros are all about that. So I'm very sympathetic to the irony bros.
All right, everybody go
That's my
dislike
comment on
Ken's
the.
videos. That's what he wants.
Yes, yes, do it.
All right.
But there any more comments?
There's one. Look at Prince Hubris. I'm not sure who that is.
Yeah, he's a guy. I think he converted from alt-rightism to irony broism, and I don't follow any of his content, and I haven't really listened to him at all. But again, I think we should be challenging one another. This should not be a hug box. This should not be a space where it's like, oh, if you challenge some form of traditional nationalism, or if you blaspheme against some talking point, that everyone just has this emotional reaction. We have to rise above that, and we have to be able to think clearly about these issues, and that means being challenged on a regular basis and being able to respond cogently without just sputtering. So whether or not he's wrong or right, again, I haven't researched his specific content, but you need people like that who are engaging, who are challenging. And everyone came away from like the Sargon debate with Spencer saying that, oh, Spencer won and blah, blah, blah. And I just think that you're taking a community, the alt-right, who is attracted to this content, who are then approving of Spencer, then coming away saying that was a victory. I think the whole thing from the start was a failure of framing it within, is the ethno-state wrong or right? It's like, whoa, hold up. The ethno-state is not a possibility. We might as well be talking about what kind of jet fuel we're going to use to get to Jupiter. Like, this is not a relevant conversation. If you're going to waste my time, like, do it with something better, do it with something constructive and productive. So people need to be challenged. It's not just, is this wrong or right? Or it's like, should we be even having this discussion? Is this the most pertinent thing to our struggle? So yeah, I probably support whatever Prince Hubris is doing, but
well, Rattle says that
what
if
he
you
is
look
doing.
at his face, it looks pure evil, like he's the spawn of some demon.
Pure evil.
Yeah.
Pure evil. I don't think he looks pure evil. He's probably just like a little bit Mediterranean or something like that.
Yeah,
Maybe he's like
same thing.
15% Filipino or something. I don't know. He's not like PewDiePie. He's not like the perfect, avatar of truth on earth or something, but I don't think he looks that evil. You haven't seen a lot of faces if you think he's the most evil person you've seen.
I'm gonna pull him up and take a look.
Let's do analysis.
I want to say real quick that I do have that link to a Discord that I've created for the purpose of this podcast. I saw someone hop in earlier. I don't know if they actually wanted to call in to the show, but it's there. And if you want to just join, then I might want to use it for other purposes as well. Anyway, just plug in that. Oh yeah, I can probably add a link to Ken's channel. That would be appropriate. I'll go ahead and do that then. I'll also look at Prince Hubris and then pull him up so that everyone can see without searching. I'm getting better at this. I'm gonna be able to do a good show, I think, one day. So is it this guy? Oh man. So apparently it's this guy. This is Prince Hubris. You probably don't see it, Aaron. I mean, Ken.
Yeah,
I'm going to do that every single episode, I hope you know.
It's going to be a trope. We're going to have fun with it. But the guy, he's obviously a gym bro. He works out. He's got the bicep. I think he usually wears like dark colored short sleeve t-shirts and has black hair, dark eyes. Kind of reminds me of James Alsop, but a little bit thicker. Yeah, I didn't look at him and say like, this is the pure avatar of evil. I do look at certain people and say that, but not him. He just kind of looks, maybe, I think he probably embraces some degree of narcissism and is really confident and so on and so forth, but I don't think that's necessarily evil.
If I was going to analyze this guy, he has a wide face, and to my mind, people with wide faces tend to be extremely pragmatic in their orientation and like grounded in actual happenings. Tend to be pretty quick as well. His eyes, yeah, they're dark, and he's just overall like this contrast between fairly light complexion and really dark hair and eyes and eyebrows, especially, does have like a devious look about it. I have like different theories about how skin tone might particularly equate to personality traits, hair color, eye color, and things like that. So one of the ideas I've played around with is like a very light skin tone is essentially like a clarity from the will, at an organic physical level. So being facile and like acting in a very free space of will, and then combining that with dark, really dark beard like he has there, and dark eyes. I see that as like the focus of the will is very earthly and which ultimately means self-serving for him, I would think. Um, but contrast that with like a dark complexioned guy with dark features like there. Like, yes, maybe he's earthly in his motivation, but then he's sort of like more, I don't know, entangled with the system in terms of his interaction with the will. I don't know if this means anything to anyone, but it's something I think about. Yeah, I get the devious look. I think we've had enough of that.
Well, it's like, I don't know. My interpretation is if you have someone who would have very pale skin, but then other dark features, then they're either going to be like a hat. It's these Nordic features mixed with Mediterranean features in a way that hasn't blended together nicely. There's this juxtaposition there. So when you think about the integration of the personality, a harmonious personality, you're going to have different parts that work together well. And when you have that physical juxtaposition, you think, oh, there must be some disharmony going on inside his mind, is the assumption that people might make. But I don't know. I don't want to insult Prince Hubris, even though I think he's probably all about just like picking random fights with people and upsetting everyone. So he probably doesn't care. Maybe he'll make a video about, no, that's too much. He won't make a video. He's got smaller brain fish to fry.
Apparently, he's half Irish and half Polish. So
I always found that sometimes the extreme Western mix with like an extreme Eastern mix has always been interesting because I like knew a guy who was half English, half Polish, and it's like, well, wouldn't you expect that he would kind of like German, like somewhere in between? But sometimes it doesn't work out that way. They get this, yeah, it's like this interesting hodgepodge of features. So I don't know. I don't know if that's recommended. Should be doing that.
Mr. Coolmug,
Irish glasses.
Mr. Coolmug says I have very pale skin and big blue eyes, with very dark brown hair and thick eyebrows. So my interpretation of hair and eye color is that really like people with black hair, very dark hair, seem to be more calm on average, perhaps. More like, I don't know how to describe it exactly. Whereas the eyes, the color seems more like really light eyes seems like an orientation upwards. Really dark, super black eyes seems like an orientation downwards. The hair doesn't necessarily have to be that way. It's more like the hair could be more like a velocity or something like that, or an energy level. Like when Goku goes Super Saiyan, his hair turns light. But
wow.
So I don't know. The Buddha was supposed to have blue eyes and like really dark hair, which makes sense if he's not this active heroic figure. Like Indra is an active hero, active representation of the divine, and has light hair. So the Buddha is like the passive manifestation of the divine. So just a thought.
Interesting. Never thought about Goku. Well, I mean, I've thought about Goku in a racialized sense of like, why did these Asians want to transform into Aryans like this? And there have been various narratives on that,
I
but
think it's an
I
ancestral
didn't think of
memory.
it specifically.
I think it's an
Yeah.
ancestral memory having to do with the ancient North Eurasians, because they do have a
Mm-hmm.
substantial admixture of ancient North Eurasian, and that is the gene
Mm-hmm.
pool from which modern blonde-haired populations derive. Now, it's according to the
Mm-hmm.
genetic evidence that's out there, they didn't actually display blonde phenotypes, but they did carry the recessive alleles for it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's, I mean, look at the Ainu in northern Japan. They do look more Caucasoid. I think there is some kind of more Europoid aspect to ancient East Asian ancestry. And maybe there is an ancestral memory of that. It could also just be from more recent memory, looking at like the activities of the Andronovo culture, even the people that the Chinese kept out with the Great Wall. I think they're called the Xiongnu or something. I don't know how to pronounce it, but maybe I could at least pull up the spelling. Yeah, I'll pull up the page for it on Wikipedia. But they were the elites of that society were Indo-European speakers, not Proto-Indo-European. They spoke a particular language clearly, but um, they were white, so there was a presence in eastern Siberia of these blondes, and I think they probably did have a big impact on the mentality of East Asians.
Mm-hmm.
You, I don't know if this is exactly in Ken's wheelhouse. Were you ever interested in anthropology?
Yeah, yeah, and kind of my take on it might be that yeah, there's the historical perspective of like, well, there's this ancestral memory of something that happened in the past, but I think another way to look at it is blonde hair was developed, it was selected for, it was promoted because there existed a prior to the existence of blonde hair, there was a will to create blonde hair. So it wasn't that blonde hair existed just randomly. Oh, arbitrarily blondness is a marker for this population that's historically associated with these activities. It was that almost. I mean, this is taking it really far, but you could stretch it to say that universally, there is, before the presence of blonde hair ever existed, all humans had this yearning for blonde hair, and that only specific populations were able to have like a rigorous enough eugenic system to actually manifest that blonde hair into reality. And that would be one explanation for why all males pretty much everywhere prefer blondes.
Yeah, I mean that is kind of true, but the strength of that desire basically reflects like a degree of aesthetic discrimination and a degree
Mm-hmm.
of commitment to an ideal. So, it, genetic, according to the Darwinian view, mutations are random, and when you're talking about features that don't have any real impact on survival in a natural
Mm-hmm.
condition in terms of being killed off by predators and stuff like that, sexual selection. What gets selected for is determined by the orientation of the will. Now, that also is, according to the Darwinian view, subject to random mutation. So it's like you need both the coincidence of the random mutation of the orientation of the will and the random mutation of manifesting the characteristic, and then incrementally over time, the populations with the stronger will to prefer the lighter features will manifest it. There's
Mm-hmm.
also obviously
Yeah.
with skin tone, other things having to do with metabolism of vitamin D and stuff like that. But I don't believe that that's the way it is. I think that actually the will has a lot to do with the mutations themselves. Um, I'm not a full blown like Lamarckian, but I do think that there is something at the epigenetic level that has some like role. The will has some role in affecting change at a genetic level. There's a level at which that's true
Mm-hmm.
just epigenetically. Our experiences do impact our genome and are passed on to our children, which therefore means that our choices have an impact on our genes. It's just like, how seriously do you want to take it? There are other aspects of this too that I think are interesting. Like, I don't know if I really subscribe to the idea of a morphogenetic field, but there is some evidence out there that common genetic information distributed across space can have some kind of like higher dimensionality connection and group experiences, like things like the 100 monkey experiment. I don't know if that's legit, but there are some very intelligent people who I take seriously, like Joseph Farrell, who have talked about this concept. There's Lieutenant or retired Lieutenant Colonel E. Bearden, who was writing like in the 80s and 90s. He has a book, Gravidobiology, that talks about some of this stuff, basically like the interaction of non-local, like kind of interstitial compressions in the space-time manifold, encoded information that do interact with organic systems. It's far out there stuff, but it's definitely pertinent to a perennialist interpretation and may have something to say about evolutionary processes. I think there's a lot of value in the Darwinian framework, because I think you can explain it to an eighth grader and they're going to get more or less get it if they're above IQ 115. But there's probably some new paradigms to look at. Also, Tiller, I forget his first name, something Tiller, has a book, Psychoenergetic Science, which is a little more new agey, but he has good data suggesting that these fields could have an impact on things, which only strengthens the case for physiognomy, and the relation of will or intentionality and actual genetic manifestation. Like, he had some experiments having to do with the gestation period and incubation period of fruit flies, and once exposed to like strong intentionality in a laboratory setting, the gestation period did see a statistically significant decrease. So I don't know. Just to throw out a lot of random out there stuff relating to this. And we have some more chats.
I mean,
do you want to try reading?
Oh, go ahead.
You can't read the chats.
I was actually going to say I'm going to be back in 2 minutes, so while you're reading those comments, I'll be right back.
That'll work. I think, Mr. Cool Mug, I think East Asians and certain Western Europeans share similar features because people in my family have very slit eyes and dark features. I mean, that's interesting. There is an East Asian influence in populations like Northern European populations, the Laplanders, Sami population, the Finno-Ugric language family has a lot of things to do with that. There is an archaeological culture. It's not even a culture, it's an archaeological horizon, like the corded ware culture, so to speak, culture. The Saima Turbino, and I would have to look that up to get the spelling and stuff. But that was all across North Eurasia, and it's definitely related to the expansion of Indo-European peoples, especially the transmission of bronze smithing and even early ironwork. So Saima Turbino phenomenon, and I'm going to put that on the screen just so you can see the spelling and everything. Certainly interesting. So I think that there were definitely Mongoloid populations involved in this, and this was a extremely wide-ranging cultural event. So, but not necessarily with the core Indo-European people. I think the interaction of East Asians and the Aryans is extensive and goes way back, and probably there's a reason for the whole like Nazi-Japanese connection, and there's a reason that a lot of people in the alt-right, at least early on, kept spamming anime memes.
Oh, they're still spamming the anime memes.
Well,
That's
that's good
still
to hear.
happening.
I'm not gonna lie. I
We'll
watch
see.
anime. I do. I'm
Yeah.
watching Full Metal Alchemist now, and I think it's a great show.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was trying to see. Well, one of the things that really struck me, if we want to go into anime, was this concept of loyalty to your master. Okay, so there's like the original Naruto plot arc is you have this person who was saved as a child by this guy. So now she has to serve him for the rest of his life. She doesn't want to kill innocent people, but she has to follow her master. And so there's like this tragic interplay there. And I was just like, it's portrayed in this heartfelt way where she's like forced by duty to serve this master. And there's just no other alternative. You couldn't just say, like, hey, thanks for saving my life. Like, I appreciate that. I'll do what I can for you, but I'm not going to just go kill innocent people against my moral code. But this person chooses to like view duty to this like adopted father figure as more important than her individual moral code. So I think there is this concept in Asian society and anime broadly that like that kind of duty focus on the individuals in your personal life, and it kind of relates to like the samurai and the shogun, and that personal loyalty is paramount and the truth is really secondary, and like whatever your individual preferences are. Whereas I think European morality tends to be a little more individualistic, and it tends to be more like the hero is the man who he might have like an evil father or something, but I mean, this is the story of Zeus and Kronos. Like he has an evil father, but he rebels and he brings about a just order according to true universal moral law, and like betrays his family in doing so, and that is really the higher moral choice. So when
Yeah.
Asians are faced with the choice of, do you choose like universal morality or do you choose your family, they tend to choose the family, whereas Europeans are like, we choose the universal morality. And that's kind of
Mm-hmm.
why there are so many white people who are so like fanatically anti-white, because they believe that in betraying their race they are making this fundamental choice of rejecting the personal in favor of the universalistic, and that really appeals to Europeans on a fundamental level. So I think that is an aspect of anime that is foreign, or there's a distinction there,
Yeah.
in the two different cultures, and I think it relates. That's part of the reason why you see such technological creativity coming out of Europe and less so from Asia, because Europe is more like, we have to reject whatever we're familiar with and embrace something higher, whereas Asia is more like, we have to reject, if it's higher, that's irrelevant. We have to maintain our like familial structure and everything that we're used to.
Mm-hmm.
Taking gunpowder and making it into fireworks versus taking gunpowder and making cannons and guns and things like that.
Right. I think that emphasis on truth in the abstract as opposed to the true social structure, I guess, if you want to put it that
Mm-hmm.
way, might be a
Yeah.
result in the West of markets for government services under the Indo European model. So the early Indo Europeans probably practiced a patronage system, which is really not all that different from like a mafia protection racket. But anyway, you could have multiple service providers, and there was no monopoly of this. So looking at the nomadic influence, that plays a role in Europe because of the level of forests
Mm,
in Europe and the amount of good land.
right.
And then in central Siberia and Mongolia, you have wide open plains. A powerful warlord is more likely to arrive at this kind of monopolistic position, and then the protection racket just takes on an altogether different form. Um, and
Mm-hmm.
so, in that market-based setting, you see not just like people who know one religion have an ideal of truth that's inextricably linked to the laws of their system, whereas people who have studied comparative mythology see what all of these systems offer and then extrapolate more general principles of true revelation or true religion. The other
Hmm.
aspect that would contribute to this East Asian orientation would be the agriculturalists. And in the expansion of agriculturalism into Southeast Europe, you had, again, it's a very heavily forested environment in Europe, and pockets of individual families or close nuclear, you know, tribal communities at a small scale. In the East, you had more of rice farming, which required larger settlements. And I think the influence of the Mongoloid raiders was probably as old as 5000 BC, because the early agriculturalists in southeastern China were already building vast moat and earthen structures, which happened in Europe as well with agriculturalists, like the Rosen culture, and before that, the linear pottery culture. They had vast walled settlements to protect from the raids of the natives. But I think the Mongolian natives, the Mongoloid expansion was far more vigorous than the expansion of the kind of decayed Cro-Magnon, post-Magdalenian, old European, not Maria Gimbutas old European, but old haplotype I European. So those are two, working together factors that lead the East towards greater collectivism. I'm sure there's all sorts of other factors that we could get into as well that would explain that. Northwest. Okay, there's one comment I'm just going to read real quick. Mr. Coolmug, James McCulloch has a theory for this, that the further northwest you go, the more individuality and creativity you find in the population. Creativity west, freedom, individuality north. Why would there be greater creativity to the west and then freedom and individuality to the north? The Western European region was the region in which the megalithic cultures arose, and that's a heritage of creativity, which has something probably to do with the Atlantean influence in my theory. But even without that, there are these megalithic temple building peoples who have a sophisticated artistic heritage. The Cantabrian, Franco-Cantabrian region has some of the greatest artwork in history. The Iberian Peninsula in the Paleolithic, and the further north you go, the more individualistic. Because if you look at the early, not Paleolithic, but Mesolithic Scandinavian populations of Western Norway in particular, they focused on islands. So, like, I kind of imagine these very isolated tribes that went to the extreme of going as far north as possible and literally segregating themselves off on this archipelago, which definitely has some implications for your personality. I think a more general science that is out there is studying personality types through the lens of migration and the kind of will that's attracted to various environments. The environment shapes the will
Mm.
over generations, but also the fact that you went there. Especially in the modern day, I think that's going to have a bigger impact on genetic distribution patterns. Like, what kind of Palestinian migrates to Canada versus what kind of Palestinian migrates to Australia? It's going to be two different orientations on average. And I'll have to look up James McCulloch. I'll do that. I'll save the name. So this went full like nerdcast, which I'm fine with, but
It's just different kinds of nerd, One man's system admin of a global financial system is another man's nerdcast. So really depends on who you're talking to. But it's almost noon,
yep.
And I've got to be going soon, and I think you have to be going soon as well. So if there are any last comments from the audience, please spam them now, or they will not be read and not recorded for all of history.
All right, well, people are spamming. I just want to remind them that the Discord link should be in the description. If it's not, I apologize for that. I'll have to find out what went wrong. But yeah, go ahead and join. Oh, and I didn't mean to put the support the Streamlabs link down there. I guess that's there by default because I use the Streamlabs chat box. But yeah, the Discord link is there. If you want to join, I might just be on at some point, not probably today, but just in general. If you want to get in contact with me, that's another avenue, a nice publicly available avenue. And that's, I think, how we will try to do the call-ins. I was hoping we could test it out if someone wanted to pop on today, but, we'll try it next time. Now let's look at the comments and... Are traps gay? Yeah, I mean, I think they have to be. I don't agree with JF's theory that there might be hypothetical heterosexual traps. I think if you're a trap, you're gay. But the white wolf.
I think traps, they're less confrontational than the trannies. They really seek to be subservient to heterosexual men rather than annoy heterosexual men. So I think they're less gay, but we have to do a discussion on sadism and masochism and homosexuality. It's far outside the scope of this video.
All right. So thanks for being on, Ken. Thanks, everybody, for listening. And we'll see you on Tuesday.
All right. See you then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. I'm trying to end the stream. I'm there twice. All right. Have a good day.